The message from the U.S. military to Iran's leadership was delivered on April 15, 2026, not through a diplomatic cable, not through a back-channel intermediary, not through carefully worded statements at a press conference, but through a live radio broadcast transmitted directly to vessels on the water in the Gulf of Oman, broadcast in the open where every ship captain and every naval commander in the region could hear it simultaneously. When the world's most powerful military chooses to deliver its ultimatum on an open radio frequency rather than through private channels, that is itself a message about the audience it is trying to reach and the seriousness with which it wants that message received. American forces broadcasting to vessels in the Gulf of Oman use the following words: discontinue transit to Iran if that is your next port of call. Do not attempt to breach the blockade. Vessels will be boarded for interdiction and seizure, transiting to or from Iranian ports. That is not diplomatic language. That is not a warning shot. That is the United States military telling every ship on the water that the U.S. Navy is now the authority that controls what moves in and out of Iran by sea, and that anything trying to reach an Iranian port will be stopped, boarded, and seized. Admiral Brad Cooper confirmed on April 15th that the U.S. had implemented a full blockade of all of Iran's ports. The Joint Chiefs Chairman Dan Kane told reporters at the Pentagon on April 8th in language that was as direct as anything a senior American military official has said publicly in years. Let us be clear. A ceasefire is a pause, and the joint force remains ready, if ordered or called upon, to resume combat. Operations with the same speed and precision. The ceasefire expires on April 21st. The Islamabad peace talks between Vice President J.D. Vance and Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi collapsed after 21 hours of negotiations without a deal. Iran's mullahs now face the most consequential decision of their regime's existence: make a deal with a superpower that just assassinated their supreme leader, or face the resumption of a war they survived the first round of but are not certain they can survive the second. In the next few minutes, you're going to understand exactly what the U.S. military just did, why this threat is one Iran cannot bluff its way through what Tehran is calculating right now, and why the days before April 24th will determine whether this standoff escalates into something far worse than what has already happened. Let us start with what happened and when, because the timeline is essential to understanding why the situation is so acute right now. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes against Iran, targeting military and government sites, killing Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, along with numerous other senior Iranian officials. The strikes were launched during ongoing nuclear negotiations, a decision that shocked the international community and produced responses ranging from condemnation to carefully worded concern from America's closest allies. Iran responded with hundreds of ballistic missiles, and drones fired at Israel, at U.S. military bases across Bahrain, Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, and closed the Strait of Hormuz to all foreign shipping. The closure of the strait, through which approximately 20% of the world's oil and natural gas normally flows, immediately sent global energy markets into shock. Brent crude prices jumped 10 to 13% in early trading after the closure, with analysts warning they could reach $100 per barrel if disruptions persisted. Major container shipping companies, including Maersk, CMA CGM, and Hapag-Lloyd, suspended all transits through the strait and related routes. 230 loaded oil tankers were anchored inside the Gulf, waiting for the strait to reopen with nowhere to go. The global economy felt the impact within days. This is the context in which every subsequent move by both sides has been made. Through March 2026, the situation alternated between military escalation and diplomatic maneuvering. Trump wrote on social media on March 6th that there would be no deal with Iran except unconditional surrender. On March 9th, he claimed the war was very complete and falsely stated that the Iranian military had been destroyed and the strait had reopened. On March 15th, he demanded that NATO and China help the U.S. reopen the passage. On March 19th, the U.S. began an aerial campaign against Iranian targets specifically aimed at reopening the strait, targeting Iranian naval vessels and drone capabilities. On March 21st, Trump issued a direct 48-hour ultimatum to Iran demanding it fully open the strait without threat, threatening to strike Iranian power infrastructure if it refused. Israel assassinated Alireza Tangsiri, the Iranian naval commander overseeing the Hormuz blockade, on March 26th. U.S. Admiral Brad Cooper stated that the assassination made the region safer. Iran remained firm in its control of the strait despite all of this. On March 27th, Iran successfully blocked 2 Chinese ships attempting to enter the strait, demonstrating it was enforcing its position against vessels from non-Western countries as well. Airstrikes on the strategically important Hengam Island in the strait on April 1st caused injuries, but did not break Iranian control. The military campaign to reopen the strait through force had not achieved its stated objective after weeks of effort and expenditure. The next phase began with a diplomatic opening. A fragile 2-week ceasefire was agreed on April 8th, brokered with significant involvement from Pakistani Prime. Minister Shehbaz Sharif and Army Chief Field Marshal Asim Munir played central roles in bringing the two sides to the same table. The ceasefire was supposed to create the conditions for a comprehensive negotiating framework. It immediately ran into problems. Iran began controlling traffic through the strait and charging tolls of more than $1 million per ship, rather than simply reopening it to normal transit. Israel continued strikes in Lebanon despite the ceasefire terms, which Iran and Hezbollah cited as violations requiring a response. By April 9th, there was no sign the agreed lifting of the Iranian blockade was being implemented at all, with ships again being prevented from moving through the strait. The Abu Dhabi National Oil Company CEO Sultan Al Jaber confirmed publicly on April 9th that the strait was still not open despite the ceasefire. The ceasefire was technically in place, but the underlying dispute was unresolved, and both sides were testing its boundaries from the first day. The Islamabad talks on April 12th were supposed to be the diplomatic breakthrough. They were not. Vance and Araghchi met with Pakistani Prime Minister Sharif before beginning 21 hours of direct negotiations. The Iranian delegation brought photographs and belongings of schoolchildren killed in a U.S. missile strike and placed them on a row of empty seats on the plane to Islamabad. A deliberate and pointed message about what the war had meant for Iranian civilians. Iran's negotiating position included demands that Israel stop attacks in Lebanon. As part of any permanent agreement, the release of $6 billion in frozen assets, guarantees around its nuclear program, and the right to charge ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. position, articulated by Vance, was that Iran could not have the ability to enrich uranium under any circumstances, that the nuclear material needed to be removed from Iran entirely, and that the strait had to be fully and unconditionally opened without toll charges. Vance told Fox News after the talks collapsed that the U.S. had made its red lines clear and that the ball was in Iran's court. He said the U.S. had put a final and best offer on the table. When talks concluded without agreement, Trump announced the naval blockade the same day. CENTCOM began enforcement at 10 a.m. Eastern Time on April 13th. The blockade, as currently structured, is a specific and calibrated instrument. It is not a blockade of the entire strait for all shipping. U.S. Central Command was explicit that the blockade will be enforced only on vessels entering or departing Iranian ports and coastal areas, while freedom of navigation will remain for vessels transiting the strait to and from non-Iranian ports. That distinction matters strategically. The U.S. is not trying to shut down global oil trade through the strait, which would cause economic damage to American allies and trading partners that would be politically unsustainable. It is trying to economically strangle Iran specifically by Iran's response was exactly what you would expect from a government that cannot afford to appear capitulating domestically, but also cannot afford to resume full-scale war. The IRGC's Joint Military Command declared that the U.S. was committing acts of piracy and maritime theft under the guise of a so-called blockade. Iran's Supreme National Security Council called the blockade a violation of the ceasefire and said Iran would prevent any conditional or limited reopening of the strait. IRGC Major General Ali Abdullahi warned that Iran's armed forces would not allow any exports or imports to continue in the Persian Gulf, the Sea of Oman, and the Red Sea if the blockade continued. The IRGC Navy declared that no vessel should make any movement from its anchorage, and that approaching the Strait of Hormuz would be considered cooperation with the enemy and be targeted. Iranian Deputy Foreign Minister Saeed Khatibzadeh told the Associated Press that Americans were risking the international community and the global economy through miscalculations, and that the U.S. was risking the whole ceasefire package. Iran's parliament was delivering messages adamantly against negotiations, pushing the narrative that Iran had the upper hand after surviving 40 days of war with two military superpowers. Parliament's deputy speaker said that Iran considered control over the strait to be a sovereign and legal matter. Then, on April 17th, when you strip away the diplomatic framing and look at it structurally. Iran is a country under significant economic pressure after decades of sanctions, a war that killed its supreme leader and destroyed major military and government infrastructure, and an oil export sector that has been under attack. The diplomatic path out of this is narrow, but it exists, and both sides appear to be searching for it even amid the military posturing. Pakistan's role as intermediary is genuine and substantial. Pakistan's military chief and prime minister have been shuttling between Washington and Tehran, carrying messages from both sides since the Islamabad talks collapsed. The White House said on April 15th it felt good about the prospects of a deal, noting that a second round of talks would likely be held in Pakistan. Vance is expected to lead the U.S. delegation if a second meeting materializes before the ceasefire expires. Iran's foreign minister said Tehran remains committed to promoting peace after meeting Pakistan's military chief. These are not parties that have decided war is inevitable. They are parties looking for a face-saving formula while keeping their military posture credible in case no formula is found. The U.S. red lines as articulated by Vance are no uranium enrichment capability inside Iran and physical removal of nuclear material. Iran's red lines are sovereignty over the Strait and the right to a civilian nuclear program. Those positions are not obviously reconcilable, but positions that seem irreconcilable in public have a way of becoming more flexible in private rooms when the alternative is a war neither side can fully control. The mullahs who survived the assassination of their supreme leader, the destruction of major military infrastructure, and the largest domestic protests in the Islamic Republic's history have demonstrated one capability above all others: the ability to endure and adapt under maximum pressure. But the naval blockade that the U.S. military has now fully implemented represents a different kind of pressure than missiles and airstrikes. It does not produce dramatic footage or martyrs. It produces empty ports and shrinking foreign exchange reserves and a population that is already exhausted and already skeptical of the regime's promises, slowly feeling the additional weight of economic isolation tighten around them. The Joint Chiefs were not being theatrical when they said the joint force is ready to resume combat. The Iranian leadership knows what happened to the infrastructure the first time. They know what a second round would look like with a military that is already reconstituting its underground capabilities because it knows the first round was not the last. The threat the U.S. military just issued is not one Iran's mullahs can afford. to ignore, not because the U.S. is necessarily prepared to execute every option it has put on the table, but because Iran cannot be certain which options the U.S. will and will not use. And in that uncertainty, the blockade continues to drain Iran's economic position every single day that the ceasefire window ticks toward its April 21st expiration. The Mullahs have a choice to make. The clock says they have very little time left to make it, and the open radio broadcast that the U.S. military chose as its delivery mechanism for this threat was not an accident. It was a signal to Iran and to the entire watching world that the United States military has made its position clear, that it has done so in terms precise enough to be undeniable, and that what happens next depends entirely on whether Tehran decides the cost of continued confrontation exceeds the cost of a deal it can live with. Every ship captain in the Gulf heard the broadcast. Every Iranian naval commander heard it. Every government in the region heard it. That is the threat that cannot be ignored.